Chapter 24 of The Return of Dr. Fu-Manchu. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elaine Tweddle. The Return of Dr. Fu-Manchu by Sax Rohmer. Chapter 24. Story of the Gables. In looking over my notes dealing with the second phase of Dr. Fu-Manchu's activities in England, I find that one of the worst hours of my life was associated with the singular and seemingly inconsequent adventure of the Fiery Hand. I shall deal with it in this place, begging you to bear with me if I seem to digress. Inspector Weymouth called one morning shortly after the Van Roon episode, and entered upon a surprising account of a visit to a house at Hampstead, which enjoyed the sinister reputation of being uninhabitable. "But in what way does the case enter into your province?" inquired Nayland Smith, idly tapping out his pipe on a bar of the grate. We had not long finished breakfast, but from an early hour Smith had been at his eternal smoking, which only the advent of the meal had interrupted. "Well," replied the Inspector, who occupied a big armchair near the window, "I was sent to look into it, I suppose, because I had nothing better to do at the moment." "Ah!" jerked Smith, glancing over his shoulder. The ejaculation had a veiled significance, for our quest of Dr. Fu-Manchu had come to an abrupt termination by reason of the fact that all trace of that malignant genius, and of the group surrounding him, had vanished with the destruction of Cragmire Tower. "The house is called the Gables," continued the Scotland Yard man, "and I knew I was on a wild goose chase from the first." "Why?" snapped Smith. "Because I was there before, 6 months ago or so, just before your present return to England, and I knew what to expect." Smith looked up with some faint dawning of interest perceptible in his manner. "I was unaware," he said, with a slight smile, "that the cleaning up of haunted houses came within the jurisdiction of Scotland Yard. I am learning something." "In the ordinary way," replied the big man good humoredly, "it doesn't. But a sudden death always excites suspicion, and..." "A sudden death?" I said, glancing up. "You didn't explain that the ghost had killed anyone?" "I'm afraid I'm a poor hand at yarn spinning, Doctor," said Weymouth, turning his blue, twinkling eyes in my direction. "Two people have died at the Gables within the last 6 months." "You begin to interest me," declared Smith, and there came something of the old eager look into his gaunt face, as having lighted his pipe he tossed the match end into the hearth. "I had hoped for some little excitement myself," confessed the Inspector. "This dead end, with not a ghost of a clue to the whereabouts of the yellow fiend, has been getting on my nerves." Nayland Smith grunted sympathetically. "Although Dr. Fu-Manchu has been in England for some months now," continued Weymouth, "I have never set eyes upon him. The house we raided in Museum Street proved to be empty. In a word, I am wasting my time. So I volunteered to run up to Hampstead to look into the matter of the Gables, principally as a distraction. It's a queer business, but more in the Psychical Research Society's line than mine, I'm afraid. Still, if there were no Dr. Fu-Manchu, it might be of interest to you, and to you, Dr. Petrie, because it illustrates the fact that, given the right sort of subject, death can be brought about without any elaborate mechanism, such as our Chinese friends employ." "You interest me more and more," declared Smith, stretching himself in the long white cane rest chair. "Two men, both fairly sound, except that the first one had an asthmatic heart, have died at the Gables without anyone laying a finger upon them. Oh, there was no jugglery. They weren't poisoned, or bitten by venomous insects, or suffocated, or anything like that. They just died of fear. Stark fear." With my elbows resting upon the table cover and my chin in my hands, I was listening attentively now, and Nayland Smith, a big cushion behind his head, was watching the speaker with a keen and speculative look in those steely eyes of his. "You imply that Dr. Fu-Manchu has something to learn from the Gables?" he jerked. Weymouth nodded stolidly. "I can't work up anything like amazement in these days," continued the latter. "Every other case seems stale and hackneyed alongside the case. But I must confess that when the Gables came on the books of the Yard the second time, I began to wonder. I thought there might be some tangible clue, some link connecting the two victims. Perhaps some evidence of robbery or of revenge, or some sort of motive. In short, I hoped to find evidence of human agency at work, but, as before, I was disappointed." "It's a legitimate case of a haunted house, then?" said Smith. "Yes, we find them occasionally, these uninhabitable places, where there is something malignant and harmful to human life, but something that you cannot arrest, that you cannot hope to bring into court." "Ah," replied Smith slowly, "I suppose you are right. There are historic instances, of course. Glamys Castle and Spedlin's Tower in Scotland, Peel Castle, Isle of Man, with its Morte Dou, the Grey Lady of Rainham Hall, the Headless Horses of Caister, the Wesley Ghost of Epworth Rectory, and others. But I have never come in personal contact with such a case, and if I did I should feel very humiliated to have to confess that there was an agency which could produce a physical result, death, but which was immune from physical retaliation." Weymouth nodded his head again. "I might feel a bit sour about it, too," he replied, "if it were not that I haven't much pride left in these days, considering the show of physical retaliation I have made against Dr. Fu-Manchu." "A home thrust, Weymouth!" snapped Nayland Smith, with one of those rare boyish laughs of his. "We're children to that Chinese doctor, Inspector, to that weird product of a weird people who are as old in evil as the pyramids are old in mystery. But what about the Gables?" "Well, it's an uncanny place. You have mentioned Glamys Castle a moment ago, and it's possible to understand an old stronghold like that being haunted. But the Gables was only built about 1870. It's quite a modern house. It was built for a wealthy Quaker family, and they occupied it uninterruptedly and apparently without anything unusual occurring for over 40 years. Then it was sold to a Mr. Madison, and Mr. Madison died there 6 months ago." "Madison?" said Smith sharply, staring across at Weymouth. "What was he? Where did he come from?" "He was a retired tea planter from Colombo," replied the Inspector. "Colombo? There was a link with the East, certainly, if that's what you are thinking, and it was this fact which interested me at the time, and which led me to waste precious days and nights on the case. That there was no mortal connection between this liverish individual and the schemes of Dr. Fu Manchu, I'm certain of that." "And how did he die?" I asked interestedly. "He just died in his chair one evening, in the room which he used as a library. It was his custom to sit there every night, when there were no visitors, reading, until 12 o'clock or later. He was a bachelor, and his household consisted of a cook, a housemaid, and a man who had been with him for 30 years, I believe. At the time of Mr. Madison's death his household had recently been deprived of two of its members. The cook and housemaid both resigned one morning, giving as their reason the fact that the place was haunted." "In what way?" "I interviewed the precious pair at the time, and they told me absurd and various tales about dark figures wandering around the corridors and bending over them in bed at night, whispering. And their chief trouble was a continuous ringing of bells about the house." "Bells?" "They said that it became unbearable. Night and day there were bells ringing all over the house. At any rate, they went, and for 3 or 4 days the Gables was occupied only by Mr. Madison and his man, whose name was Stevens. I interviewed the latter also, and he was an altogether more reliable witness, a decent, steady sort of man, whose story impressed me very much at the time." "Did he confirm the ringing?" "He swore to it. A sort of jangle, sometimes up in the air near the ceilings, and sometimes under the floor, like the shaking of silver bells." Nayland Smith stood up abruptly and began to pace the room, leaving great trails of blue gray smoke behind him. "Your story is sufficiently interesting, Inspector," he declared, "even to divert my mind from the eternal contemplation of the Fu Manchu problem. This would appear to be distinctly a case of an astral bell, such as we sometimes hear of in India." "It was Stevens," continued Weymouth, "who found Mr. Madison. He, Stevens, had been out on business connected with the household arrangements, and at about 11 o'clock he returned, letting himself in with a key. There was a light in the library, and getting no response to his knocking, Stevens entered. He found his master sitting bolt upright in a chair, clutching the arms with rigid fingers and staring straight before him with a look of such frightful horror on his face that Stevens positively ran from the room and out of the house. Mr. Madison was stone dead. When a doctor, who lives at no great distance away, came and examined him, he could find no trace of violence whatever. He had apparently died of fright, to judge from the expression on his face." "Anything else?" "Only this. I learnt, indirectly, that the last member of the Quaker family to occupy the house had apparently witnessed the apparition which had led to his vacating the place. I got the story from the wife of a man who had been employed as a gardener there at the time. The apparition, which he witnessed in the hallway, if I remember rightly, took the form of a sort of luminous hand clutching a long curved knife." "Oh, heavens!" cried Smith, and laughed shortly. "That's quite in order. This gentleman told no one of the occurrence until after he had left the house, no doubt in order that the place should not acquire an evil reputation. Most of the original furniture remained, and Mr. Maddison took the house furnished.